Chapter 17:16. She wasn't a good drinker to begin with, but even with a good stomach, drinking like this would cause her to have problems sooner or later. That night, it was a dinner party with ATV's biggest partner. She wasn't feeling well, but she forced herself to come. Linda was quite angry. In the past, Mr. Yi wouldn't need to beg these people. Now, they were all good and bad, sponsoring the title sponsorship and asking Mr. Yi to endorse their products. Moreover, the other party was a bath brand under Procter & Gamble. Filming this kind of advertisement meant that they had to take off their clothes. As for how much they had to take off, it would depend on the effect. This is simply taking advantage of the situation. Linda and Yi Liangqiu walked out of the private room together. She supported Yi Liangqiu and said angrily, "Mr. Yi, why did you agree to him?" Yi Liangqiu's hand was on the wall. If the title sponsorship of ATV's ACE program doesn't renew the contract, it will be the last straw that breaks ATV's back. Linda understood. She just didn't want Mr. Yi to feel wronged. Mr. Yi. She still remembered watching Mr. Yi's movies before. They were so dazzling, but now, he was bowing down to those people for ATV. Yi Liangqiu patted her hand. "Go to the parking lot and drive the car to the entrance. I'm going to sober up." Linda was worried, but she looked again. Fortunately, Mr. Yi wasn't too drunk, so she left first. Linda left first. Yi Liangqiu leaned her back against the wall for a long time before she moved to the bathroom to wash her face with cold water. But just as she moved, her eyes froze. In front of her stood Qin Anlin and, of course, Xia Mian. Qin Anlin was wearing a gray sweater, black trousers, and a coat on his arm. Although it was simple, he still looked outstanding. Xia Mian was much cooler. She wore a black dress with a coat draped over her shoulders. Her brown curly hair was much more exquisite than before. Yi Liangqiu only took a glance and knew that the coat was from the brand she usually bought. She did not make a sound and only stared at them. Qin Anlin only paused for a moment, then walked over. He brushed past her. When he walked past her, she could feel the coldness from his body. When he walked past her, Xia Mian gently placed her hand on Qin Anlin's arm. She then smiled sweetly and said, "Mr. Yi, are you eating here too?" Compared to her sweet and charming appearance, Yi Liangqiu was in a sorry state. He was wearing an ordinary turtleneck sweater, and his long hair was casually let down. His jacket was in his hands, and the smell of alcohol was overwhelming. He looked like a complete alcoholic. "I'm done." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and waved her hand as if she didn't care too much. "President Qin."
"Goodbye."
With that, she staggered into the bathroom, ignoring the two people she met by chance. Qin Anlin stopped walking. Xia Mian looked up at him. "President Qin, do you want to go see Mr. Yi? He smells of cigarettes. Did he get bullied?" Qin Anlin's eyes fell on her face. His gaze was a bit sharp, and Xia Mian did not dare to say anything. However, he walked straight to the bathroom and only said lightly to her, "You go first." Xia Mian smiled triumphantly. So, what if President Qin went to see that woman now? President Qin would only hate Yi Liangqiu because of the smell of cigarettes and alcohol. She flipped her hair and pushed open the door of a private room. In the bathroom, Yi Liangqiu washed his face and felt that his head was much clearer. Chapter 17:17. As soon as she looked up, she saw Qin Anlin in the mirror. She paused and sneered. "Is President Qin here to see me make a fool of myself?" Qin Anlin's body leaned against the wall of the bathroom, and his voice was indifferent. "I thought Mr. Yi hadn't reached that point yet." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. She turned around, leaned her back against the sink, and looked at him. "Then how miserable does President Qin think I should be miserable?" He moved forward, one leg stuck between her body, and his slender body also leaned forward. Such a posture was very shameful. He lifted her chin with a finger, and his gaze was slightly cold. "When the ATV can't be saved, and you're like a stray dog." She lifted her chin along with his strength, and her long black hair spread out behind her. She looked extremely heroic, but because of the alcohol, she looked particularly charming and moving. "President Qin thinks that I will have such a day?" She smiled lightly, then wrapped her hands around his neck and exhaled. As long as Su Shurching doesn't let go, I think even if thousands of ATV employees lose their jobs, President Qin probably won't be able to get the ATV. In the face of her teasing, Qin Anlin was unmoved. He stood straight and looked at her coldly. I don't think Mr. Yi will sit back and do nothing. She smiled lightly and tilted her head. Don't you think too highly of me, President Qin? I'm not that great. He still looked at her coldly and didn't speak again. Instead, he removed her arms from his neck and said in an almost insulting tone, Mr. Yi, please behave yourself. A body that has been slept with thousands of times is not that attractive to me. He took a step back, his attitude cold. Her gaze fell on something, and she still smiled lightly. Is President Qin used to saying one thing and thinking another? Then she shrugged. Or is it because of Xia Mian? CEO Qin is infatuated with her body? Qin Anlin pinches her chin. Yiliang Qiu, I don't mind letting you know whether I dare to sleep with her or not. Sleep. She smiled. I also want to test if other men are interested in my body. His gaze instantly turned cold as he forcefully released her chin. Immediately, 5 finger marks appeared on her chin. His voice was as cold as ice beads. Yiliang Qiu, I don't mind letting you know the consequences. What consequences can there be? She said self-deprecatingly. The worst outcome is divorce, isn't it, Qin Anlin? She looked straight into his eyes. Since you're going to do it, be more ruthless. He looked at her deeply. This is the Yiliang Qiu you mentioned. She grunted and then stood up straight. She touched her forehead with her slender fingers and smiled. Yes. She walked forward with her back straight, and her voice couldn't be clearer. Qin Anlin, I'm a little tired of this kind of mutual harm. Her arm was caught by him. She turned her head and looked at the coldness on his face. She was still smiling. Yiliang Qiu, you can also quit. He gave in and gave up the biggest step in Qin Anlin's life. Leave the Su family, leave ATV, and let's be together. She was obviously startled for a moment. When he said together, he meant together. Was it the same as before? Chapter 17-18. She still had to walk the path that she was supposed to walk. She didn't know the outcome, but she would have a clear conscience. She had to get rid of Su Shurching with her own hands so that they wouldn't face each other and that secret wouldn't surface. She looked down and smiled. Anlin, I don't want to force myself to be your accessory. Also, my surname is Su, and yours is Qin. You know that. With that, she broke free from his hand and walked towards the entrance of the hotel. As she walked, she laughed so hard that tears rolled down her cheeks. She would rather he be cruel to her, and she would rather it end sooner. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to withstand his hatred. She was really afraid. Qin Anlin looked at her back and slowly clenched his fingers into fists. His knuckles turned white from the force. When he walked into the private room, Xia Mian served the investors very well. She was no longer the Xia Mian she used to be. After what happened with Che Taixian, she couldn't walk the path of a pure and innocent girl anymore, so she simply followed the rules of the entertainment industry. When Qin Anlin walked in, a director of a film and television company greeted him with a glass of wine. President Qin, you're late. You have to drink 3 glasses as a punishment. Qin Anlin was troubled, but he still took the glass and drank 3 glasses in a row. The spicy taste entered his throat, and his Adam's apple moved slightly. It was very tempting. Xia Mian watched him drink 3 glasses and immediately handed him a tissue. President Qin, wipe yourself. Qin Anlin didn't refuse and casually wiped himself. In fact, tonight was also a men's party, but one of them had taken a fancy to Xia Mian, so he brought her here. As for whether Xia Mian was willing, it was up to her. He wouldn't force her. After sitting down, Xia Mian poured him a glass of red wine and said gently, How did your talk with Mr. Yi go? Qin Anlin glanced at Xia Mian and didn't say anything. The others were all experienced people. How could they not know that Qin Anlin was displeased? They were curious as to how a woman like Xia Mian, who had poked President Qin's sore spot, managed to survive in King Entertainment to this day. Maybe Maybe the rumors were true. Xia Mian looked a bit like Yi Liangqiu. Since President Qin and Mr. Yi had a falling out, it was a good idea to have Xia Mian by his side. The man who had asked for Xia Mian was a little hesitant. After all, he didn't know what President Qin was thinking. If there was something going on between President Qin and Xia Mian, wouldn't he offend President Qin by taking advantage of her? Therefore, during the banquet, Qin Anlin only said a few words indifferently, "It's fine." This was enough to show his stance. President Ding was immediately overjoyed. He repeatedly toasted Xia Mian and made her drink several times. Xia Mian was in a good mood and came here with Qin Anlin, so she didn't think too much about it during the banquet. She couldn't hold back and said that Yi Liangqiu had accepted a role in a P&G commercial. Other people would feel embarrassed, but Xia Mian really didn't know what to do. If President Qin didn't care, he would have left a long time ago. President Qin wanted to deal with ATV and Su Shiqing, not Yi Liangqiu. What man would want his wife to take off her clothes and shoot a commercial like that? No matter how elegant the commercial was, it was still going to be naked. Men would care and go crazy. Besides, Mr. Yi, Queen Yi, which man hadn't thought of her as a goddess? Chapter 17-19. The activity in the private room went on for 2 to 3 hours. Most of the men in the room would talk vulgarly. Xia Mian had gotten used to it. She quietly played with her phone. Occasionally, President Ding would call her over for a drink. After drinking too much, Xia Mian was a little tipsy. She wanted to leave, but she didn't want to give up such an opportunity. Maybe when she left, President Qin would send her back. Such opportunities were rare. Therefore, she held on until the end of the dinner. But in the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She was 80 to 90% drunk. She didn't even know that Qin Anlin had left. When Xia Mian woke up, she was on the bed in the hotel room. She was only wrapped in a sheet. Her female instincts told her that she had slept with a man. She opened her eyes and closed them again. Feeling the vague sense of fullness, the corners of her mouth slightly curved up. She smelled the refreshing scent of a man. Then, her lips were kissed, President Qin. She was elated and shy. Closing her eyes, she accepted the man's kiss and murmured. But the gentle love she imagined didn't happen. Then, the man slapped her mercilessly. "Bitch." This voice? Xia Mian opened her eyes and looked at the man in front of her in surprise. It wasn't President Qin, she knew him. People called him President Ding. Why was she in his bed? Xia Mian suddenly wrapped herself in the sheet. Her eyes were full of tears as she stared at President Ding. Her lips were slightly trembling. President Ding was in his 40s. He was actually quite good-looking. His favorite thing to do was to play with celebrities. But he knew which celebrities he could play with and which ones he couldn't. Xia Mian, for example, looked like a virtuous girl, but after watching the video with Che Taixian, she was nothing but a prostitute in his eyes. Since she was a prostitute, she could sleep with him as long as he spent money. President Ding was quite strong. He only had a bath towel around his body. Seeing Xia Mian's reluctance, he straightened up and grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the bedside table. He pulled out a cigarette, put it between his lips, lit it, and took a long drag. Then, he looked at Xia Mian and sneered, "I've slept with you twice." He was quite satisfied with her body. After all, Xia Mian was young and hadn't slept with many men, so she was relatively clean. Besides, it was thrilling to play with a female star, so it didn't matter if he spent a lot of money. Xia Mian's lips trembled even more. She buried her head in her knees and didn't speak. Seeing her like this, President Ding was a little unhappy. With a cold face, he said, "Do you still think that you can climb into President Qin's beds?" Xia Mian pursed her lips, and the color of her lips turned even paler. "If President Qin was interested in you, you wouldn't be in my bed." CEO Ding was expressionless. "Tell me, what do you want before you sleep with me?" CEO Ding was a businessman and a northerner. He was very crude and did not have much literary talent. Thus, he spoke very rudely about such things. Xia Mian couldn't stand it. Tears welled up in her eyes. CEO Ding found her annoying. Wasn't it normal for a female star to sleep with a man? What was the point of making her chastity so obvious? But men often had a deep-rooted bad habit. The harder it was to get a woman, the more they wanted her.
Just like now.
CEO Ding turned around and wrote a few checks.
He threw one in front of Xia Mian.
1 million. Xia Mian didn't say anything. 2 million. Another check was thrown. Chapter 1720. President Ding threw down all the checks in his hand. 10 million. Do you want to sell it? 10 million. Xia Mian looked at the checks. 10 million was enough for her to buy a house in B City. She hesitated. President Ding sneered, knowing that she was willing to sell it. He pinched her chin and slowly moved his hand up, squeezing her lips. He stood on the bed, and she knelt on the bed with the checks under her knees. It was as if she was kneeling on the money, humiliated, but also greedy and eager. Serve me here, and I'll add another 5 million. His rough fingers touched her rosy lips, and his voice was hoarse. Xia Mian carefully moved over, her fingers lightly. President Ding sneered. He had never failed to take down a female star. He could sleep with whoever he wanted. Of course, he did think about Yi Liangqiu, but it was just a thought. It wasn't entirely because of President Qin, but because Yi Liangqiu gave him the feeling that she was like the bright moon. He could only admire her from afar. Xia Mian served him well, and he was satisfied. After they were done, he gave her another 5 million. President Ding put on a pair of pants and left without hesitation, leaving Xia Mian and the 15 million behind. Xia Mian went to the bathroom and frantically rinsed herself. She could accept that time with Che Taixian was for the role. But this time, she was completely selling her body. She desperately rinsed herself, but couldn't wash herself clean. She came out in a bathrobe, and there were checks scattered on the bed, with President Ding's smell on them. Disgusted, she picked up the checks and wanted to tear them up, but she couldn't bear to do it. She had worked so hard to get this money. Late at night, Xia Mian walked out of the hotel with trembling legs. President Ding was tough, and every time he took her, she felt as if a stake had been nailed into her body. It hurt, but it was even more humiliating. Xia Mian didn't call her assistant. Instead, she flagged down a taxi. When the driver asked her where she was going, she unconsciously told him Qin Anlin's address. After saying it, she was in a trance, and after a while, she felt bored. But the car had already left, so she didn't stop him. She just looked out the window with her chin on her hand. When the car arrived, Xia Mian paid the driver and got out. She stood in front of the mansion and looked at the tall building in the dark night. In the past, she could almost come in and out of this place. She believed that if Yi Liangqiu didn't come back, she could enter Qin Anlin's heart. However, Yi Liangqiu came back, and she was struck out so quickly. She really wanted to ask Qin Anlin why. Why did he send her to someone else's bed? Xia Mian leaned against the cold wall. With a cigarette dangling from her lips, she dialed Qin Anlin's number with the other hand. She knew that he had insomnia. It was Qingxiu who told her that he was still awake at this hour. The call was picked up by him personally. She should be thankful that Yi Liangqiu wasn't asleep on his body. Xia Mian's voice was a little shrill. Why did you do this? Qin Anlin was indeed awake. He was standing on the balcony of his bedroom, looking at a small downstairs with a blank expression on his face. It was Xia Mian who was sitting awkwardly on the ground. He knew in his heart that Xia Mian had slept with President Ding. Since she had slept with him, what was the point of being downstairs now? Pay attention to your identity and your location. His voice was cold, and he was about to hang up the phone. Chapter 1721. Like? When Qin Anlin heard this, a mocking smile appeared on his face. He said slowly, Xia Mian, you don't like me. You like power. Xia Mian's phone slipped from her hand. Power? Perhaps it was. From the first time she saw him, she had fallen for him. But he didn't want her. He didn't want her. No matter what Yi Liangqiu did or how bad she was, he couldn't leave her. Yes, he loved that bitch. He loved her to death. Xia Mian got up from the ground and walked to the road in a daze. Cars flew past her one after another, and the white lights were so bright that she couldn't open her eyes. But Xiaomian didn't seem to feel it and continued to walk forward like a ghost. She kept murmuring, "I thought too much. I thought too much." Qin Anlin stood on the balcony and looked at Xiaomian, his lips pursed into a straight line. He knew very well that Xiaomian couldn't be helped. Her self-control was too weak, and her personal charm wasn't enough to reach the top. And he hadn't given up on her, probably because she was a little like Liang Qiu. After watching for a while, he went back to the bedroom. Lying on the bed, he unlocked his phone and looked at the photos on it. It was a photo of him and Liang Qiu in the past. "Do you know you're very hateful?" he said softly as his fingers fell on her face. But no matter how much he said, she couldn't hear him. Did she think he was dead when she wanted to shoot that kind of commercial? Of course he knew that she was forced into a dead end. However, they had the rules of the game, and she had broken them. It was a new week. Yi Liangqiu sat in her office and looked at the report on the table. Linda stood to the side and didn't dare to make a sound. Yi Liangqiu looked up and said calmly, "How long can the series we bought last?" "Less than 2 months. Linda sighed. "Mr. Yi, the director of King Entertainment has an appointment this afternoon. Do you want to meet him? Is there anything important?" Yi Liangqiu's tone was particularly indifferent. She looked down at the report again. Linda hesitated again and again before saying softly, "He said he's here to discuss the acquisition." Yi Liangqiu puts her hand on the table. The sound is not low. Linda is startled and does not dare to say anything. After a long time, he heard Yi Liangqiu's voice. "Let's make an appointment. I also want to meet President Qin." Linda nodded. "I will arrange it." Seeing that Mr. Yi was in a bad mood, she didn't dare to disturb him. She went out and closed the door. After she left, Yi Liangqiu looked up, her brows furrowed slightly. Qin Anlin had already closed the net on ATV, and it seemed that it was time for her to fight to the death. Although it was risky, as long as there was a 50% chance, she would try. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Yi Liangqiu met Qin Anlin in the reception room. Other than Linda and Kaim, there was no one else. The atmosphere did not relax in the slightest because of the small number of people. Instead, it was very tense. Qin Anlin directly threw out a document. "This is the 25% of the shares I have collected. I think if there is another 20%, ATV will become the object of King Entertainment." Yi Liangqiu looked down and smiled faintly. "Isn't it too easy for President Qin?" Chapter 1722. So, is this 25% enough to influence ATV's decision? Qin Anlin's voice was still cold. "For example, Mr. Yi wants to personally shoot a commercial. I think it will damage the company's image." Yi Liangqiu smiled. "If President Qin wants to replace me as the CEO, he probably has to listen to Mr. Su. After all, he is the largest shareholder, and President Qin's main purpose today is to acquire. I think it's better to talk to Mr. Su directly." Qin Anlin's eyes were burning. "I know Mr. Yi has a way, but I won't help you." Yi Liangqiu's expression was cold and indifferent. "I'm the CEO of ATV, and I will be loyal to the company." Qin Anlin sneered. "Then, you will make thousands of people in ATV pay a painful price. The person who will cause the harm is you?" Yi Liangqiu sneered. "Since President Qin wants to do it, why pretend to be benevolent? I don't remember you being so soft-hearted before." He narrowed his eyes and glared at her. "President Qin, I advise you to be calm." She leaned over and said softly, "If you're not afraid of causing a bad impact, you can buy it by force, but I'm afraid that the ATV you buy will be worthless." He also stared into her eyes, and his voice was tense. "You don't care?" Yi Liangqiu smiled softly. "What do I care? President Qin, what I want has always been the same as what you want." She was no longer short of money, wasn't she? Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and looked at her, then pursed his lips and didn't say anything else. The negotiation had broken down. She still had to stand on ATV's side, or rather, on Su Shurqing's side. Qin Anlin didn't force her, which was expected. However, he was still a little sad in his heart. He still wasn't used to it, or he still couldn't accept such a fact. He leaned against the car door and smoked. Kaim sat quietly in the car, waiting for him. Keim knew very well that President Qin had already shown mercy. If he hadn't shown mercy, he might have used unscrupulous means to suppress them. He rolled down the window, and Qin Anlin handed him a cigarette. Keim took it and lit it. He puffed out a smoke ring and said softly, "Keim, you've seen everything." Keim couldn't say anything. After all, it was Boss Qin's family business. Qin Anlin cursed under his breath, opened the door, and got on the car. As soon as the black RV drove away, 2 more RVs drove over and stopped at the original spot. The car door opened, and Xing got off first. He welcomed Su Shirqing carefully. Su Shirqing leaned on his crutches and looked at the ATV building. He sighed softly. Things are different now. Xing supported him and said softly, "Mr. Su, Xing doesn't know about these, but Xing will protect you well." Su Shirqing forced a smile. "Yeah. Why am I telling you this? You don't know anyway." After he finished speaking, he looked at Xing meaningfully and spoke more slowly. "Xing, you seem to be quite happy today." Xing was stunned. After a while, Xing said, "Xing is happy to be with Mr. Su every day." "You're getting better at talking. This isn't like you. You're not being honest." Su Shirqing glanced at him, but he didn't make things difficult for him. Xing secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Chapter 17:23. Xing's face was a little red. He restrained himself for a long time. When Su Shirqing arrived at Yi Liangqiu's office, Yi Liangqiu and Linda were in the middle of handing over some matters. The door was not closed. Su Shirqing stood at the door and listened for a while. Although he was anxious, he was still comforted. This girl always had ATV in her heart. She did not betray Qin Anlin. It seemed that ambition needed time. Su Shirqing thought silently. His daughter would not be satisfied with mediocrity. It was right for Liangqiu to be like this. Su Shirqing coughed lightly and walked in slowly. Yi Liangqiu and Linda's conversation stopped abruptly. She looked at Su Shirqing in surprise. After a long time, she came back to her senses and called him CEO. "You sound so distant." Su Shirqing walked to the sofa and sat down. He signaled with his eyes, and Xing walked out. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda. "Go make a cup of tea for Mr. Su." Linda nodded and went to get a cup. When she was making tea, there was a little white powder in her hands. Her hands were trembling, and her gaze was a little blank. She knew what this meant. It meant that she had completely betrayed Mr. Su. If she was found out, she would die a horrible death. Linda was also hesitant, but in the end, she still chose to betray. With trembling hands, she poured the powder and mixed it evenly. When she carried it out, Linda had already put on a proper smile. She half knelt down to serve Su Shirqing the tea. "I know that CEO likes to Hong Pao. Mr. Yi specially kept it as a premium product." Su Shirqing was quite satisfied. He looked at Yi Liangqiu. "That's very thoughtful. As long as Dad likes it." Yi Liangqiu smiled and took a sip from her cup. Su Shirqing also took a sip. The taste was indeed his favorite, but tasting tea was not his main goal. He was concerned about the future of ATV. "Do you have any countermeasures for the acquisition of King Entertainment?" He tapped his finger on the cup, and his eyes were like torches. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "If I say there is, will Dad believe me?" Su Shirqing chuckled. "Of course I believe you." He looked straight at her as if he wanted to see through her soul. "Liangqiu, tell me your plan." Yi Liangqiu looked around and smiled. "It's not the right time yet." She looked at Su Shirqing and tried to stall for time with him, waiting for the medicine to take effect. Sure enough, after chatting for 5 minutes, Su Shirqing couldn't take it anymore and slowly tilted his head. Yi Liangqiu lifted her chin slightly and looked at Linda. She said softly, "Call Xing over." Linda's heart was beating fast. She had never done such a thing before. Moreover, the one who fell was Su Shirqing. She nodded and walked out without stopping to call Xing in. When Xing came in, his face was still slightly red. But when he saw Su Shirqing's head tilted to one side, he got a shock. He looked at Yi Liangqiu in fear. Xing was not a fool. Although he was a dutiful person, He heard from others that Sir and Missy did not get along. And now Sir had collapsed. Could it be Missy's doing? His heart was beating like thunder. There were already 100 thoughts in his mind. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and said calmly, "Carry Sir to the resting room inside. Sir is a little tired and has fallen asleep." She then told Linda, "Call a doctor over to take a look at Sir." Linda nodded and went out first. Only Xing, Yi Liangqiu, and the sleeping Su Shiqing were left at the scene. Xing was in a battle with heaven. He was sure that Sir would not collapse for no reason. It must be Missy's doing. Chapter 17:24. His breathing was a little hot. He stared at Yi Liangqiu with a burning gaze. Yi Liangqiu got up and walked to Xing. She placed her hand on his shoulder gently. "Xing, what's wrong? Why aren't you carrying Sir in?" Xing panted slightly and looked at her hesitantly. Yi Liangqiu smiled. "He's just asleep.
He'll be fine."
Xing felt more at ease. He was stunned for a while before he carried Su Shiqing. Su Shiqing had lost a lot of weight over the past year. He looked like an empty shell. Xing was 1.8 meters tall, and it was effortless for him to carry Su Shiqing. He bent down and placed Su Shiqing down carefully. After all, he had always been in awe of Su Shiqing. Even though Su Shiqing was unconscious, Xing still did not dare to act rashly. However, when he turned around, he almost bumped into Yi Liangqiu, who was behind him. His lips brushed against her hair, and he could only smell her fragrance. Therefore, Xing's mind uncontrollably recalled the dream that he had every night. His face was buried in Missy's long hair, and he smelled the same fragrance. His face was very red, his breathing was messy, and he did not know where to put his hands and feet. Yi Liangqiu had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She used the ATV's low status to exchange for such an opportunity. Xing was the only breakthrough. "Mr. Su will wake up in 2 hours. I will say that he suddenly fainted because his blood sugar level is too low." Yi Liangqiu said faintly, "The doctor will say the same thing too." Xing pursed his lips and hesitated for a while before asking, "Missy, why did you treat Mr. Su like this?"
"Why?"
Yi Liangqiu looked at Xing with a gentle gaze. "Xing, do you want to know?" Xing nodded vigorously. He suddenly realized something and shook his head vigorously. "Missy, please don't make things difficult for me. Xing is only responsible for protecting Mr. Su. Today's incident is over." His voice became very soft as he was troubled. How could Yi Liangqiu not know the struggle in his heart? Xing was honest and stubborn. She smiled and suddenly reached out to hold his hand. "What if I want to make things difficult for you?" After he finished speaking, he stared at Xing. Xing was at a loss again. He stuttered for a long time before he squeezed out a sentence. "Eldest miss?" Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "Don't call me young Mississippi. Just call me Liangqiu." "I don't dare." Xing lowered his head and spoke in a hoarse voice. Yi Liangqiu watched as his face turned red all the way to his collar. His entire body was probably as red as a shrimp. She leaned closer and said in a low voice, "You even dare to have that kind of dream. What else do you not dare to do?" The moment she said this, Xing's eyes widened and he stuttered, "Missy, how did you know?" Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "Now let me ask you, where is Qin Pei?" Once she knew Qin Pei's whereabouts, Su Shiqing would not need to stay in this world anymore. Xing's face was pale. He stared at Yi Liangqiu's face and understood that he was dreaming. He thought that Missy had feelings for him. It turned out that Missy was thinking about that matter. He was not clear about that matter. He had only heard about it from others after struggling for a long time. He said softly, "Mr. Su did not mention about that matter." Chapter 17:25. Xing's eyes lit up and dimmed after a while. He asked softly, "Can I really do it?" Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "Of course. It just depends on whether you want to or not." Xing hesitated for a while and looked straight at Yi Liangqiu. He said slowly, "I'm willing to work for Elder Mississippi." After he said that, he broke out in cold sweat, and so did his palms.
Yi Liangqiu was still smiling. All right.
Ah Xing, you're very smart. You should know what to do. Ah Xing's face turned red. He looked at Su Shicheng, who was sleeping soundly, and replied, and then Yi Liangqiu patted him. Then you'll look after Mr. Su now. Her words seemed to have given Ah Xing a sacred mission. Ah Xing's face was radiating an unprecedented spirit. After Yi Liangqiu finished speaking, she walked back to her seat and continued to read the documents. She was also waiting for Su Shicheng to wake up. Of course, she could kill Su Shicheng now. But firstly, she had no way to escape. Secondly, Qin Pei would most probably die. Su Shicheng held onto the documents for about 1.5 hours before he woke up. The moment he opened his old eyes, he looked around sharply. His expression was also somewhat guarded. Sir, you're awake. Ah Xing went forward and helped Su Shicheng up. You suddenly fainted just now. Elder Miss has looked for a doctor. Su Shicheng put on his shoes and squinted his eyes. What did the doctor say? Ah Xing looked at Su Shicheng sincerely and said, the doctor said that I'm old and my blood sugar is on the low side. Then, Ah Xing said more sincerely, Sir, Elder Miss is still very concerned about you. Ah Xing can tell. These words dispelled Su Shicheng's doubts. He smiled faintly. That's true. After all, we're father and daughter. We're different from others. He looked around and realized that it was the lounge in Liangqiu's office. He asked Ah Xing to help him out. When he walked out, he saw Yi Liangqiu sitting behind the desk and flipping through the documents. She looked a little tired. Su Shicheng coughed softly. Dad, you're awake. Yi Liangqiu raised her eyes and looked at Su Shicheng. She immediately stood up and walked over, helping him to sit on the sofa. Su Shicheng's heart was also somewhat comforted. He waved his hand and said, Go on with your work. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and didn't speak for a long time. After a long time, she said quietly, Dad, don't worry about the company. I'll take care of it. Su Shicheng patted her hand. If it was someone else, I would naturally believe in your ability. But it is Qin Anlin. How can I rest assured? Moreover, although ATV couldn't compare to King Entertainment in terms of resources, it was still beyond his expectations that they could not withstand a single blow. Back then, the scandal between him and Su Chun had severely damaged the vitality of ATV. Otherwise, he would have personally come forward. Thinking of this, Su Shicheng felt a little upset. Liangqiu, it's been hard on you. Then he gave Ah Xing a look and said, Go out for a while. I have something to discuss with Missy. Ah Xing glanced at Yi Liangqiu, then left and closed the door. When there was only Su Shicheng and Yi Liangqiu left, Su Shicheng was obviously not as calm. His tone was a little anxious. How are you and Qin Anlin recently? Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. You've seen it too. ATV's situation is my current situation. Chapter 17:26. Yi Liangqiu interrupted him. Dad, only the shares and management rights of ATV can appease his anger. You should know this better than me. Su Shicheng was dispirited at the mention of this. He looked at Yi Liangqiu and said slowly, Whether you believe it or not, this is the most regretful thing I've ever done. Until today, he would dream of Hong Ke looking at him with tears in her eyes. She would call him Shicheng and say that he had made her suffer a lot. When he woke up from the dream, he was covered in cold sweat. He did not dare to tell anyone about this dream. He never dared to. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Dad, these are not important. The important thing is, she looked at him. Dad, have you ever heard of the phrase, retreat in order to advance? Retreat in order to advance? Su Shicheng chewed on this phrase and looked at her with a burning gaze. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Yes, retreat in order to advance. Su Shicheng did not say anything but looked at her quietly. She leaned over and whispered a few words. There was a strange look in Su Shicheng's eyes. There was doubt, but also doubt. Yi Liangqiu still smiled faintly. Of course, Dad, you can choose not to believe me. After all, we used to be enemies. But now, I have no way out, don't I? Su Shicheng looked at her for a long time before he nodded. Let me think about it. Yi Liangqiu poured a cup of tea for herself. Of course. Su Shirqing's gaze fell on her face. After a long time, he got up and called out, "Ah Xing." Ah Xing came in and knew that it was time to leave. He quickly helped Su Shirqing up. Before Su Shirqing left, he repeated again, "I'll think about it carefully." Yi Liangqiu nodded and suddenly changed the topic. "I'll accompany Dad to the hospital for a checkup one day later." Su Shirqing was stunned for a moment and waved his hand. "You can just focus on your work. Ah Xing will accompany me." As he spoke, he walked out. Yi Liangqiu looked at him from behind. He was no different from an ordinary old man. But she knew that Su Shirqing was Su Shirqing. If he didn't die, he would still be ruthless. Su Shirqing and Ah Xing went out and sat in the car. Ah Xing drove the car. At first, Su Shirqing closed his eyes slightly. Then, he suddenly lifted his eyelids and asked casually, "Missy wants me to transfer the shares of ATV to her. What do you think, Ah Xing?" Ah Xing paused for a while and laughed dryly. Ah Xing doesn't know about these things. "Mister, please make the decision." Su Shirqing chuckled. "Yeah, you don't understand." "Ah Xing, look, I don't even have anyone to talk to now." After saying that, he sighed softly. "I'm old, and there are many things that I can't do. I'm not as bold as I used to be when making decisions. It's time for me to retire." Ah Xing quickly said, "Mister is still young, it's still early." Su Shirqing laughed again. "Only you know how to coax an old man like me." He paused for a while. "Actually, I'm not afraid." Liangqiu still has her scruples. As he spoke, Ah Xing's palms were sweating. He didn't say anything for a long time, as he was afraid that he would expose himself if he opened his mouth. Once they returned to the villa, Su Shirqing said lightly, "Ah Xing, from now on, you'll have to work for me honestly. You'll definitely benefit from it. Missy will definitely divorce Qin Anlin in the future. I like you very much." Ah Xing was stunned when he heard that. He waved his hands desperately. "Mister, I don't dare to. Ah Xing doesn't deserve Missy." Chapter 17:27. Ah Xing's palms were full of sweat. So was his forehead. The sweat was as big as beans and dripped down like rain. After a long while, he said dryly, "Sir, you only know how to tease Ah Xing." Su Shirqing smiled again and patted Ah Xing's shoulder. "There's something I need your help with. You're the only person I can trust by my side now." That gentle pat on the shoulder made Ah Xing feel flattered and fearful. He stuttered and said, "As long as Ah Xing can do it, I will do it for you." Su Shirqing looked at Ah Xing and smiled. "I know you're loyal, but I think if you become my son-in-law, I will trust you more." Ah Xing didn't understand his words. He didn't dare to hope for Missy. He only felt that Sir was testing him or joking with him. But Su Shirqing continued, "There's an opportunity now. It depends on you if you're willing to grasp it." He called Ah Xing over and whispered a few words in his ear. Ah Xing was stunned. He didn't come back to his senses for a long while. Then, he looked at Su Shirqing blankly. Ah Xing was shocked. He was so shocked that he peed his pants. When he turned around, he shook his head. "Ah Xing doesn't dare. As long as you dare to think and do it, there's nothing you don't dare to do." Su Shirqing's voice was cold. "Ah Xing, your loyalty depends on your performance." More sweat appeared on Ah Xing's forehead. The beads dripped down one by one. He didn't dare to make a sound. Su Shirqing's voice was gentle. "We'll talk about it in the future." He was too profound. Ah Xing couldn't understand his intentions and didn't dare to ask, but Ah Xing quickly understood what he meant. A week later, it was a Saturday night. Su Shirqing returned to the Su residence. Yi Liangqiu and Momo were having dinner. Momo was already 1 year old. His teeth were almost fully grown, and he could eat liquid food. Yi Liangqiu would personally cook some baby meals for him no matter how busy she was. He had already lost a lot of childhood happiness with her. She would try her best to do whatever she could. When Su Shirqing appeared, Yi Liangqiu was obviously stunned. Then, she said softly, "Dad, you're here?" He raised his voice and asked the servants to bring another set of chopsticks and bowls. "Let's eat together." Su Shirqing sat down and hugged it. He played with it for a while before handing it back to the housekeeper.
I've eaten.
Go make a cup of tea for sir. Yi Liangqiu whispered to the servant beside her. Don't put too many tea leaves. Su Shiqing also got up. I'll go upstairs and rest for a while. Yi Liangqiu nodded. Su Shiqing looked at Xing and said in a hoarse voice, Help me up. Xing nodded his head and supported him into the hall. Then, they slowly went upstairs. Yi Liangqiu watched with a burning gaze. After a while, she whispered to the nanny, Look after the young master. Alone, Ji Yunshu quietly followed him. In the master bedroom on the second floor, Su Shiqing did not lie down after entering. Instead, he gently turned on a switch. When the entire wall was moved away, Xing was shocked. He turned his head and looked at Su Shiqing. Sir? Accompany me in. Su Shiqing's voice was a little hoarse and stern. He was probably going to see an old friend. Xing responded with an oath and supported Su Shiqing as they walked in the dark secret tunnel. His heart was beating very fast, thumping, thumping, thumping. His palms were also sweaty. Under the dim light, Su Shiqing's voice was heard. Xing, are you nervous? No. Xing was not very natural. His voice was also hoarse. It's a little gloomy here. Chapter 17:28. When Su Shiqing heard this, he chuckled softly. His laughter echoed through the long corridor, making his hair stand on end. Xing's hair stood on end. I'll bring you to meet someone. Someone that Missy has always wanted to meet. Su Shiqing broke away from Xing and walked quickly. He did not look like someone who had walked past the gates of hell. He seemed to have become 10 years younger in an instant. Xing was stunned. He stopped in his tracks and felt that something was wrong. But he had no choice. Su Shiqing's voice was calm. Xing, didn't you always want to know my secret on behalf of Missy? Now that I've brought you here, you should be happy. As he spoke, Su Shiqing turned around. The light shone on his back and cast a deep shadow on his haggard face. He looked like a ghost. Behind him, there were a few lights and a huge wooden prison. There was a person locked inside. That person had no legs and was just sitting. His long hair was scattered all over his body. It was hard to tell if he was a man or a woman. Xing looked at him. His lips moved, and his legs felt weak. At this moment, he instinctively knew that Su Shiqing had been suspicious of him. Xing, do you know what made me suspicious? Su Shiqing laughed softly. You used Missy's photo in your phone. Xing's forehead was full of sweat, but he still pretended to be calm. Missy is the Empress. I admire her. Admire her? Su Shiqing walked one round around Xing and stopped in front of him. His eyes were like torches. Then why did you help Missy to lie to me? Xing blurted out. Mr. did faint that day. But just as he finished his sentence, his face turned pale. Then he knelt down. Mr. Su. A black gun barrel was pressed against his forehead. He looked up and cold sweat was dripping down. Drop by drop, the cold sweat fell on the cold ground. Very soon, the place became even colder. Unknowingly, there were 4 men in black standing beside Su Shiqing. All of them looked cold. Su Shiqing bent down and patted Xing's face lightly. Xing, you have disappointed me. Xing knelt down and did not even pant. Su Shiqing sighed softly. It seems that Liangqiu values you too much. A silly child like you is so honest that you can be tricked easily. Xing's body trembled twice. He raised his eyes and stared at Su Shiqing. He suddenly pleaded loudly. It's Xing's fault. It's Xing's fault. Xing only cares about eldest Mississippi. It was Xing who used Sir's matter to encourage eldest Mississippi. This matter has nothing to do with eldest Mississippi. Su Shiqing looked at him and chuckled. You're quite loyal. Since you're so devoted to Liangqiu, I'll give you a chance. Su Shiqing smiled sinisterly. Xing, your Missy is at the door now. Go and catch her. Fear appeared on Xing's face. He turned around abruptly and saw Yi Liangqiu holding onto the wall at the entrance. She seemed to be trying to escape. But how could Su Shiqing let her escape? He gently pressed a button, and the wall at the entrance slowly closed up. The cold basement was quiet. It was so quiet that it was scary. Now that you know my secret, what do you want to do? Su Shircheng sat on a wooden chair with a relaxed expression. Yi Liangqiu stood there for a long time. She knew that she couldn't escape. She decided to get down slowly and walked to the front of Su Shircheng. Have you been pretending all along? Chapter 17:29. Su Shircheng's expression was indifferent. He glanced at Ah Xing, who was kneeling at the side. Missy is here now. You like her, and she tried to seduce you to work for her. Now I'm giving you a chance to make her yours. Ah Xing shook his head vigorously. Ah Xing doesn't dare to. Mister, Ah Xing is a boorish man.
He's not worthy.
Su Shircheng's gaze was sharp. He stood up slowly and snatched the gun from his underling. He used the butt of the gun to smash Ah Xing's head. Useless. You can't even handle a woman. Ah Xing fell to the ground. There was a trickle of blood on his forehead. He used all his strength to look at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu's face was expressionless. Su Shircheng's gaze alternated between their faces. He then sneered. Did you see that? You wholeheartedly helped her, but she didn't even plead for you. Ah Xing was still lying on the ground. He didn't dare to move. His voice was weak and weak. Ah Xing doesn't dare to have such thoughts towards Missy. Su Shircheng looked up and his underling immediately stepped on Ah Xing's head. Su Shircheng's voice was deep and slow. There was no emotion in it. You have two choices now. One is to have sex with your Missy. The other is for your Missy to have sex with someone else. He looked around. You're not the only man here. Ah Xing was stunned. His head was stepped on and his teeth were red. Blood slowly flowed out from the corner of his mouth and dyed the cold ground red. He tilted his gaze and struggled with his fingers on the ground. Every time he struggled, the underling would step on him harder. But he still moved bit by bit. Finally, he held onto Su Shircheng's leg and tightened his grip. Missy is your daughter. Yi Liangqiu's body tensed up. She didn't say a word because she knew that once she opened her mouth, Ah Xing would become her weakness. Ah Xing's ending would be even worse. She felt guilty, but there was no turning back. She could only look at him coldly without any emotions. Su Shircheng gave Ah Xing a kick. Useless thing. He lifted his eyes and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Remember, Ah Xing is suffering because of you. He gestured for the man to lift his leg and sat down. I'll count to 3. If you don't agree, your Missy will have sex with someone else. As he spoke, he looked at Yi Liangqiu. This is what you get for being disobedient. What do you have to say? From now on, she would have someone else, and it would be impossible for her to be with Qin Anlin. Moreover, he would also send a big gift to Qin Anlin. Thinking of Qin Anlin's expression, it must be very interesting. Really? Yi Liangqiu's eyes were filled with coldness. There's nothing to say. Su Shircheng looked at her suspiciously, but he soon sneered. You're a smart person. As he finished, he looked at Ah Xing. Ah Xing was lying on the ground and panting. After he heard that, he quickly crawled over and hugged Su Shircheng's leg. Mr. Su, I beg you, please let Missy go. Missy will be obedient in the future.
She will listen to you.
Su Shircheng leaned forward and patted his face lightly.
2.
Ah Xing was stunned. His eyes were wide open as he looked at Su Shircheng. He didn't understand. Why could Sir be so cruel to his own daughter and let someone else rape her? Missy was as noble as a fairy. Just thinking about it made him feel guilty. How could he do such a thing to her? Chapter 17:30. His gaze was filled with sorrow as he looked at Yi Liangqiu. She had been very calm. Ah Xing, she is my daughter. You and she are not from the same world. If you are cruel to her, you will walk into her world. Su Shircheng said coldly and threw a gun to him. If she is not willing, you know what to do? Ah Xing looked at the gun by his feet and was stunned for a long time before he crawled over and picked it up. He did not mind that he was like a dog. He only minded that he could not protect Missy even if he was like a dog. He was stupid to spoil Missy's plans and implicate her. Ah Xing looked up and looked at Su Shircheng. He asked softly, "Really? If I have sex with Missy, I will be able to have her?" Su Shircheng raised his hand, and one of his underlings passed him a bottle of medicine. Su Shircheng took it and poured out a pill from the bottle and placed it on Ah Xing's palm. "This can help you. Do you want to eat it yourself or Missy? It's up to you." Ah Xing's eyes were bloodshot. He looked at the pill for a long time before he picked it up and put it into his mouth. "Very good." Su Shircheng smiled faintly. "Ah Xing, turn into a wild beast." Ah Xing stood up slowly. He walked towards Yi Liangqiu, grabbed her, and kissed her lips.
His body was firm.
She was trapped in his arms, and it was almost painful. He kissed her forcefully. Their lips were rubbing against each other. His eyes were wide open as he looked at her. She was the same. Ah Xing's eyes were filled with apology and sorrow. "Missy, I'm sorry." He picked her up and walked towards a small, dark room at the side. Su Shircheng did not stop him. Liangqiu was his daughter after all. It was fine as long as the matter was settled. He could not make things difficult for her. After all, he still needed her in the future. Ah Xing carried Yi Liangqiu into the house, and she was immediately pressed against the wall. Ah Xing's body was very hot, and his breathing was messy. He was panting with every breath he took. "Missy, I can't hold on for long. In a while you have to scream, understand?" He whispered hoarsely behind her ear. Yi Liangqiu, who had been tense the whole time, finally relaxed a little. "Ah Xing, I have implicated you?" She sighed softly. "I don't blame you." From the moment she returned to the Su family, she was prepared to accept anything, including the worst. Ah Xing was stunned and his body tensed up. "Eldest miss, you have to call him later." He closed his eyes and pressed his large palm against her shoulder. He carefully held her in his hand and didn't let her back touch the rough wall. He was a rough person, but the young miss was of noble birth. He didn't want to hurt her. She heard the sound of fabric ripping, and her whole body froze. However, the expected pain and unbearable pain did not happen. Only Ah Xing's face was flushed. He leaned forward and pretended to be oblivious. He let out a passionate voice and pinched her shoulder. He begged in a low and hoarse voice, "Missy, can you call me twice?" This was the only way for Su Shircheng to let her go and think that she was really violated by Ah Xing. Yi Liangqiu knew that he was in pain. He had taken Su Shircheng's medicine and he must be having an orgasm now. However, he was unbelievably gentle. He endured it and even protected her. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were filled with warmth. She leaned her face on Ah Xing's shoulder and said softly, "I'm sorry." Sorry was not enough to express her apology to him. Ah Xing smiled bitterly. He didn't say anything and continued to act. Yi Liangqiu lay on her stomach and closed her eyes. She let out a painful sound that no one would doubt the authenticity of it. About 5 minutes later, a stream of hot blood splashed beside her legs. Then, a gun was stuffed into her hand. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. "Eldest miss, Ah Xing can't hold it in anymore." Ah Xing lowered his head and rested it on her neck. Chapter 1731. There was a strong smell of blood in the air. That was Ah Xing's blood. That was all his desire and love for her. He liked her, but he knew that they were not compatible. Hence, he was willing to sacrifice himself for her. Yi Liangqiu held the gun in her hand. Her body was trembling and her voice was trembling. "Ah Xing, Ah Xing. How could he be so stupid? How could he do that?" Actually, she did not care much about it. Her so-called self-esteem was nothing in exchange for an innocent life. Moreover, she was the one who dragged him into this. Otherwise, Ah Xing would be fine. One day, he might marry a kind girl from his hometown and have a cute child. She was trembling. That trembling went all the way to her heart and soul. Her fingers were stained with Ah Xing's hot blood. She had no other thoughts but to let him live. Ah Xing lifted his eyes slightly. His gaze was filled with pain. "Elder miss, Ah Xing's death is not to be regretted. This was because he had treated her excessively in his dreams. He was too greedy. His forehead was filled with beads of perspiration. Drop by drop, it dripped down his forehead. His legs could not support him, and he slipped twice. Yi Liangqiu immediately supported him. "No, I won't let you die." There was a flurry of footsteps at the door. She looked at the door and threw the gun in her hand. "I didn't shoot him." "No, it's him." She held her head with her long and bloody fingers and shook her head vigorously. Xing lost his support and slid down in an instant. His body was full of blood. Su Shurching frowned. "What happened?" Xing turned his head and tilted it again. He squeezed out a sentence. Xing deserted. Su Shurching looked at Yi Liangqiu. "Did you shoot him?" "No." Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little shrill. Her messy and wet hair stuck to her face. She looked extremely pathetic. She looked at Xing blankly. She looked at his bleeding body and said blankly, "It's not my fault. You were the one who wanted to do that to me. It's not my fault." Su Shurching squinted his eyes and sneered. "Send Xing to the hospital." Two men in black carried Xing away. Then, Su Shurching squatted down. His gaze became affectionate as he looked at Yi Liangqiu. "You must be very scared, right? Daddy is here. No one can bully you." The withered and yellow hand gently embraced her and brought her to his shoulder. But what he said next was cold and ruthless. "I will give the recording to Qin Anlin. Think about how he will react when he hears it." Yi Liangqiu suddenly raised her eyes and stared at Su Shurching. Her gaze was extremely unfamiliar. She couldn't understand why this man, who was her father, could do such a cruel thing to her. Before she could think clearly, she had already asked softly, "What do I have to do to not tell him?" Su Shurching gently turned her face. Then he slowly stood up and looked down at his daughter. "You're finally negotiating with me, aren't you?" Su Shurching's eyes flashed coldly. "I want King Entertainment. Do you understand?" His fingers pinched her chin. "I know you have a way. Qin Anlin's weakness is you." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "I want ATV's shares." Chapter 1732. He leaned over and said softly, "You feel guilty now, don't you? But let me tell you, one day, when you obtain supreme power, you'll get used to other people's sacrifices." With that, he stood up. "I will take Qin Pei away. Before you acquire King Entertainment, you will not see him again." Before Yi Liangqiu could speak, Su Shurching turned around and smiled coldly. "I know what you are most afraid of." Suddenly, the blood and strength in her body seemed to be sucked out. Su Shurching actually knew all along. She could not hide anything from him. Su Shurching turned around and left. He raised his hand and asked someone to take Qin Pei away. Yi Liangqiu had seen through Qin Pei. After what happened a year ago, Qin Pei was becoming more and more inhuman. Without making a sound, he was carried away in a daze. In the cold dungeon, Yi Liangqiu was left alone. Her body was cold. She lowered her head and looked at the blood on her hands. This pair of hands could not be washed clean. From the moment she returned to the Su family, it had been washed clean. She went to the hospital to see Xing. His life was saved, but it was unlikely that he would have another child. Yi Liangqiu stood outside the ward and did not disturb Xing. After that, she begged Su Shurching to give Xing to her. After Xing recovered, he stayed by her side. She knew that every pair of eyes in the Su family villa could be watching her at any time. Su Shurching could be aware of everything she did. She was forced to a dead end. Sometimes, when there was no way out, she could only turn back. In the quiet car, Xing was driving while Yi Liangqiu was in the back seat. Linda was in the front passenger seat too. Yi Liangqiu said faintly, "Xing, you can rest for 2 more months." Xing's complexion was not as good as before, but he was still all right. He smiled and said, "I can't stay idle." In his heart, he was grateful to Missy. She had taken him from Su Shurching's hands. Otherwise, his life would have been worse than death. Missy did not mention that matter again, and he would not mention it. No matter how useless Ah Xing was, he still had some pride as a man. He drove the young lady and Linda all the way to his studio. "I'll wait in the car." Yi Liangqiu nodded. "Okay." Linda followed her to the studio inside. Walking in the narrow corridor, Linda couldn't help but say, "Mr. Yi, actually, you don't have to shoot. I will make a comeback and make a film." Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda. "This advertisement is the best way to make a comeback." Because it was explosive enough, there was a topic to talk about. Linda was stunned and didn't come to her senses for a long time. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and smiled bitterly. "I really can't turn back. If she wanted to live, if she wanted the people around her to live, she could only do as Su Shiqing said." However, when Su Shiqing stood at the highest point, she would ruthlessly fall down, smashing his body into pieces. Linda didn't really understand, but she didn't say anything more. She always felt that Mr. Yi was a little different recently, but she couldn't tell what exactly was different. It seemed that there was more coldness in his eyes, and there wasn't much warmth in them. She opened the door for Yi Liangqiu. The studio was already prepared. The CEO knew his way and didn't make things difficult for them. He cleared the set, and the cameraman was also the one filming. Chapter 1733. Yi Liangqiu asked them to do the post-production after she had seen the trailer. However, she had an agreement with the company that the advertisement would only be broadcasted on ATV for half a year. Everything was calm and peaceful. Su Shiqing did not appear often. He probably knew that she was disgusted by the sight of him, so he called her most of the time. What he was most concerned about was when ATV would be able to dominate the entertainment industry. Yi Liangqiu hung up the phone and looked at the trailer sent by P&G on the table. She inserted the CD into the computer and clicked on it to watch. The advertisement was shot in the bathroom. Naturally, it was a little erotic. However, she definitely did not show her legs. That pair of fair legs should be a stunt double that was shot in the post-production. As it was not considered as showing her legs, she did not call them to question them. Instead, she continued to watch the trailer. The trailer was shot well, and there were no problems. The CEO of the company was rather respectful as he allowed her to watch the trailer first before deciding whether to broadcast it. After Yi Liangqiu finished watching the trailer, she took out her phone and gave the other party a reply. After she hung up the phone, she closed her eyes and leaned against the back of the chair. She felt a little exhausted. Su Shiqing had transferred all his shares to her name. He was not afraid that she would play tricks on him. Yi Liangqiu looked at the report in her hands and pursed her lips. She would give Su Shiqing all the glory, and that day would be the day of his death. There was a knock on the door. She looked up and looked at Ah Xing. Ah Xing's expression was very calm, as though he was following her dutifully. It was as though that incident had never happened. "Elder miss, the car is ready. We can go to the airport anytime." Yi Liangqiu nodded and stood up. Ah Xing naturally took over the briefcase from her and followed beside her. When they got into the car, Ah Xing's voice was a little soft. "Elder miss, can you trust Ah Xing?" "What's wrong?" Yi Liangqiu sat down and asked in surprise. It had been quite some time since that incident. Ah Xing had been following her for about a month or two, and he had never mentioned anything. She was a little surprised when he asked her this question. Ah Xing turned around and said calmly, "The person serving Mr. Su is a relative of mine from the same hometown." Yi Liangqiu was stunned. Ah Xing pursed his lips tightly. "I know Missy's concern. You're afraid of implicating others. But Mr. Su, he will hurt a lot of people." His eyes narrowed. "And I hate it too." Yi Liangqiu had never seen such an expression on Ah Xing's face before. She couldn't react in time. "Eldest young mistress, feel free to tell me if there's anything you need Ah Xing to do." Ah Xing gritted his teeth. Ah Xing has already died once, and there's no hope in the future. Don't be afraid. Yi Liangqiu's throat seemed to be blocked. After a while, she said softly, "Next time, I won't let you take risks." To her, Ah Xing was a stranger. However, she only had Ah Xing by her side. To a certain extent, Ah Xing gave her a sense of security. In that darkness, he was the one who sacrificed himself. Those few minutes, the blood he shed for her, she would never forget it. She didn't say it because she didn't want to hurt his pride, but it didn't mean that she didn't forget or feel guilty. Xing started the car and sent her to the airport. Just when the car stopped, Su Shiqing's mobile phone rang. Yi Liangqiu picked up the call. "Where are you?" Su Shiqing's voice was a little gloomy. Recently, he had been checking her location from time to time. Chapter 1734. Su Shiqing's voice was stern. "Who are you going to meet in Hong Kong?" "Dui Wesheng." Yi Liangqiu sneered. "I'm sure you know that ATV's cash flow is poor, and Dui Wesheng has always been interested in my 10% shares of King Entertainment." As soon as she finished speaking, Su Shiqing was surprised. "You really dare to sell that 10%? He had been thinking about this 10% for a long time, but to cover it up, he didn't tell her directly. But now, this 10% was going to fall into Dui Wesheng's hands. Who didn't know Dui Wesheng's ambition? But if Liangqiu did this, Qin Anlin would probably break up with her. Su Shiqing thought about it and felt that it was a good deal. He was satisfied and hung up the phone. Yi Liangqiu looked at Xing. "I've booked 2 plane tickets. You're coming with me." Xing was stunned. He had a feeling that Missy was going to do something important. She actually brought him along. "Xing, didn't I say that I can look for you if there's anything?" Yi Liangqiu opened the car door and waited for him to get out. She smiled. "From now on, we can't let Su Shiqing catch us for any mistakes, understand?" Xing nodded his head in confusion. Yi Liangqiu stayed in Hong Kong for 2 days and sold 10% of King Entertainment shares for 50 billion. After signing the contract, she left Hong Kong. But she didn't expect Dui Wesheng to hold a celebration party in Hong Kong and make it so big while she was on the plane. The financial and entertainment circles of B City were in an uproar. Qin Anlin was accused of being cheated by a deity. He felt like he was being cheated on. Yi Liangqiu didn't know that when the plane from Hong Kong to B City landed, Xing helped her with her luggage and followed behind her. When she passed through the exit, she was surprised to see 2 rows of reporters. When she came out, she was blinded by the flashing lights. "Miss Yi, or should I say Mrs. Qin, did you consider President Qin's feelings when you sold your shares in King Entertainment? Mr. Yi, does this mean that ATV has reached the end of its tether, or is Mr. Yi preparing to fight with King Entertainment? Mr. Yi, do you think President Qin is already on his way to the airport? Will he divorce you?" Xing looked at Yi Liangqiu worriedly. Yi Liangqiu just put on her sunglasses and walked out from the VIP passageway, ignoring the reporters who were taking photos behind her. Xing followed behind her and caught up with her. He tilted his head and looked at her. "Mr. Yi, what's going on?" As Yi Liangqiu walked, she said, "Dui Wesheng has great ambitions for the Chinese market. He's not satisfied with just 10% this time." Xing didn't know much about business matters, but he knew it was serious. Besides, those reporters just said that President Qin and Mr. Yi would divorce. He pursed his lips and hesitated. "Do you want to explain to President Qin?" This time, Yi Liangqiu stopped in her tracks and looked at Xing. She forced a smile. There's no need to explain this kind of thing. It was useless to explain. She knew better than anyone what that 10% meant. It meant that Qin Anlin trusted her and the last bit of trust between them. She had sold this trust and her past to someone else. She let out a deep breath and patted Xing. "Let's go." Chapter 1735. Xing looked at her deeply and didn't say anything in the end. He didn't understand most of the conversations he had with Missy. Now he learned to speak less so that Missy wouldn't be upset. However, both of them didn't expect to bump into Qin Anlin once they got out of the airport. To be precise, Qin Anlin came looking for them personally. It showed how exasperated he was. Xing was held down by someone, and he couldn't move. Yi Liangqiu frowned and looked at Qin Anlin, who was sitting at the back of the car. "Let him go." The person who was pressing Xing pressed Xing's head down again. Xing let out a groan. "Qin Anlin, did you hear me?" She kicked the car door and said in a hoarse voice, "Just come at me if you have any problems. Let Ah Xing go." Qin Anlin turned his head slowly, and his gaze fell on her face. He sneered, "Come at you?" She pursed her lips into a straight line and looked at his dark eyes. She didn't feel confident. She used 10% of the money that he gave her in exchange for 50 billion yuan. She put it into her pocket quietly. Of course, she felt guilty. Qin Anlin continued to sneer, "Yi Liangqiu, he's just a follower. Is he worth your effort?" He knew her very well. How could he not see the worry on her face? Ironically, she was worried because of that little follower. A burly man. She remembered that he used to follow Su Shiqing. Now he was following her. Qin Anlin's gaze fell on Ah Xing, and he took a few more glances at him. Su Shiqing had something on Yi Liangqiu, so she felt more or less uneasy. She stared at Qin Anlin, trying to determine if he knew something. However, Qin Anlin only looked at him for a while and asked his men to let Ah Xing go. Ah Xing refused to leave. Yi Liangqiu said calmly, "Drive the car back. President Qin will send me back." After she said that, Ah Xing had no reason to stay. He threw her a worried look and walked towards Yi Liangqiu's car. Qin Anlin watched as Ah Xing's car drove away. He retracted his gaze, took out a cigarette skillfully, and lit it up. He said faintly, "Why aren't you getting in the car?" Yi Liangqiu looked at him, pursed her lips, and got into the car. As soon as they got into the car, Kaim started the engine. The car drove very fast, and she just got off the plane. Her head was a little dizzy, but she stubbornly did not say anything. "I didn't expect you to have such a huge appetite now." Qin Anlin rolled down the car window and flicked the cigarette ash away. Then, he turned his head and looked at her with a burning gaze.
Why?
"Can he comfort you?" Yi Liangqiu's heart skipped a beat, but seeing the jealousy on his face, he probably didn't know about it. She turned her face to the other side and said faintly, "Qin Anlin, do you really have to talk to me about this? I thought you'd be more willing to talk to me about 10% of the things." He held the cigarette in his hand and pinched her cheeks with 2 fingers, forcing her to look at him. The cigarette butt in his hand was less than a centimeter away from her soft cheeks. If he wasn't careful, he would burn her. He stared at her with a burning gaze. "Yi Liangqiu, aren't you afraid of dying quickly?" She raised her head. "What do you want?" His fingers exerted more force. "What do I want?" When did he not want to do anything to her? However, what could he do to her? Yi Liangqiu, she dared to act so recklessly because he loved her. Yes, he loved her shamefully. Chapter 1736. Yi Liangqiu. She dared to act so recklessly because he loved her. Yes, he loved her humbly and shamefully. His heart ached, but then it hardened again. He had been soft-hearted towards her for too long, and she was getting more and more out of hand. "That 10% was all I could give you when I proposed. Yi Liangqiu, you know what that means." His gaze became colder. "Did you hesitate when you sold it? Did you waver, huh?" He took the cigarette butt with his other hand. She thought that she would be more at ease, but it made it easier for him to exert force. Her cheeks immediately turned purple. Those who didn't know better would think that she had been forced to do something indescribable for him.
No.
She looked straight into his eyes, her lips moving slightly as she squeezed out 2 words. He let go of her angrily. Losing her support, she fell into the back seat and hit the back of her head. Through the pain, she vaguely heard what he said. She wanted to hear it clearly, but her instincts were against it. She didn't want to hear it because those words were too cruel. Yi Liangqiu's gaze stopped on his face and didn't move away for a long time. She only heard the last word. "Get lost." He wanted her to leave. Kaim looked worried and stopped the car by the side of the road. He had thought that Yi Liangqiu would be chased out of the car. But a man in a rage could change his mind at any time. It was as unreliable as a woman's menopause. "Kaim, get out of the car." His voice was tense. Yi Liangqiu's body froze. Just as he understood her, she understood him too. Kaim felt the same way. There weren't many people on the road, and it was dark. If President Qin were to do anything violent to Mr. Yi wouldn't be able to survive. Keim's heart softened, and he was worried. But Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. Are you going to get off, or should I drag her off? He sighed inwardly, and didn't dare to say anything else. He opened the car door and got out. Just as he got out of the car, he heard the sound of the car window locking. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to leave. In the car, the light was dim, which made his face look even scarier. Qin Anlin, if you want a divorce. Before she could finish, he interrupted her with his kiss. A very rough kiss. He held her face in his hands and pressed her against the car window. He pressed her down tightly and kissed her passionately. His scorching hot lips tore at her lips, and soon, her lips started to bleed. He tasted the taste of fresh blood. He was like a beast, even more savage. On this day, he received news. He felt as if he had returned to the day his mother passed away. She was just as hateful. She didn't explain and didn't care if they were breaking up. She just wanted to do what she wanted to do. He bit her neck and said in a hoarse voice, Yiliangqiu, have you ever loved me? She was stuck to the car door. As long as he opened the door, she would be doomed. Her lips moved a little, but he didn't allow her to speak. He kissed her lips again roughly. He bit her fiercely as if he was venting the dissatisfaction and anger in his heart. His body was trembling. He had a feeling that he was going to lose her. He had to let go of his pride and hatred so that he could have her. But if he did that, he wouldn't be Qin Anlin anymore. Chapter 1737. Finally, he let go of her and leaned against the back of the seat. His breathing was messy, but his eyes were clear. She was in a mess as she leaned against the side pathetically. After a long time, he finally turned his face and looked at her. Go. But she couldn't move at all. That kiss just now seemed to have used up all her energy. In the dark car, he looked at her. Then, he took out a cigarette from his jacket and slowly lit it up. He let out a long puff of smoke and said indifferently, Yiliangqiu, I once gave in. Isn't it funny? His voice was bitter and bitter, with a hint of disgust. But I won't do it again. He had even abandoned his own mother because of this woman. He had overestimated her love. He had thought that no matter what she had done, she would still love him. But now he didn't think so, and as he spoke, she kept looking at him. She knew clearly that she had challenged his bottom line. She had expected this outcome before she had done it. She lowered her eyes and sighed softly. Anlin, find a woman. This was something she would never have said in the past. In the past, she had been so spirited. Even if he hated her, she would have accepted it. She felt that he was hers, and she wouldn't allow anyone to take him away from her. But now, looking at his pained expression, she would rather he had someone else. At least he would be happier. As soon as she finished speaking, her chin was pinched. His strength was enough to crush her. Even in the dark of the car, she could still see his gloomy face. He repeated her words word by word. Find a woman? He pinched her chin tightly and pulled her in front of him. He stared into her eyes and said, that way you won't feel too guilty, right? He held her chin tightly, as though he was holding her entire soul. Narrowing his eyes, he said, Yiliangqiu, say something. Her lips trembled slightly. Looking at his dark face, she gritted her teeth and said, yes.
Great.
Really great. This was the woman he loved. This was the woman who had always said she loved him. Yiliangqiu, where's your love? Has it been fed to the dogs? He gave a faint smile. Although his voice was soft, it had a hint of madness to it. She could not answer. Qin Anlin let go of her. Get out of the car. She retreated until her body was pressed against the car door. The faint light from outside shone in, shrouding her face in darkness. His fingers trembled as he held the car door. Finally, he opened it. When she went down, her legs were a little weak. The night wind outside was slightly cold, brushing against her face like a knife. B City was brightly lit. Those lights climbed into the distance, forming a long golden dragon. The black limousine next to him quickly drove away, leaving no trace of nostalgia. Yi Liangqiu felt a chill run down her spine. After a long pause, she finally walked forward. She couldn't stop because it was too cold here. When Xing found her, she was so cold that she almost fainted. Sitting in the car, she felt as though she had been in heaven for a lifetime. Xing stopped the car at the entrance of a convenience store and bought a cup of hot milk for her. Yi Liangqiu drank half of it and felt that her body was much warmer. However, she still had a cold, and her nose was running nonstop. Xing knew that she was upset and did not dare to disturb her. He only drove quietly. The greatest pride of his life was ATV, the logo on the ATV building.
Bastard.
If the ATV building is sold, will it still be ATV? Su Shicheng was very angry. Yi Liangqiu did not force him. She just chuckled. But 40% of the ATV building is already Qin Anlin's. Su Shicheng was very dissatisfied with what she said. With a gloomy face, he said, "If it weren't for your inaction, how could it be so bleak?" You haven't eaten anything all day. Yi Liangqiu snapped out of her trance and looked at Xing. "I can't eat." "Even if you can't eat, you have to eat something," Xing advised gently. Yi Liangqiu took another look at him. Xing was different from before. In the past, he was a rough man. But now, she couldn't tell, he was different. It was probably because after that incident, both psychologically and physically, there had been some changes. In the end, she still ate something. Xing sat opposite her and ate. Chapter 1740. However, Yi Liangqiu was thinking about something else at this moment. She needed the Chens to protect her. She put down the chopsticks in her hand and looked at Xing. "Arrange something for me tomorrow. I want to meet Kaim." Xing was stunned. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. "Is there any difficulties?" Xing shook his head. Yi Liangqiu smiled. "Only let him know, understand?" Xing looked up at her and said softly, "Mr. Yi, I will protect you." She smiled again and didn't say anything. She sat for a while and went upstairs slowly. Xing looked at her back. Although he was not cultured, he was not a blockhead. He could feel that Elder Miss treated him well because she wanted to make it up to him. However, he didn't want her to feel guilty. He only wanted her to be happy. In the future, if Elder Miss still wanted to be with President Qin, he would help her even if he had to risk his life. Yi Liangqiu went upstairs, took a shower, and lay on the bed. When she closed her eyes, she would think of Qin Anlin. However, from that day onwards, they didn't contact each other anymore. She clenched her fists. Success or failure depended on this. She knew how dangerous what she was doing was. If she was not careful, she would be doomed. The next day, she met Kaim in a secret coffee shop. As promised, Kaim arrived alone and booked a small private room. Yi Liangqiu and Xing went over together. Xing stood guard outside, while Yi Liangqiu opened the door of the private room. Kaim looked up and his eyes met Yi Liangqiu's. After a while, he smiled bitterly. "Mr. Yi is here." Yi Liangqiu sat opposite him and smiled. "You used to call me Liangqiu. It's never been so distant." Kaim sighed. "Mr. Yi, the fact that I'm here to see you alone shows that I'm not a stranger." Others didn't know, but Kaim knew very well that President Qin was drafting an agreement related to their marriage.
It was hard for him to say.
However, President Qin seemed to have drafted it for a long time and never sent it out. He must still be reluctant in his heart. Yi Liangqiu could also see Qin Anlin's attitude from Kaim's attitude. If the situation wasn't too serious, Kaim wouldn't be like this. She felt a little sour in her heart, but she did not mind. She took out a document from her bag and handed it to Kaim. "Find a way to get President Qin to sign this document." She paused for a moment before saying softly, "Don't let him find out what's written on it." There was a look of surprise in Kaim's eyes. He took it. After reading a few lines, his expression changed. Mr. Yi, it's just like what you saw. No matter what happens in the future, this document is very important. She pressed her hand on the document. I've already signed it. Kaim, no matter what happens between President Qin and me in the future, you have to stand by his side and bring him back quietly. Kaim's eyes were a little dazed. He didn't understand what she meant. You'll know when the time comes. She smiled bitterly. Kaim, if I said that I had my reasons, would you believe me? Kaim nodded and said firmly, I believe you. There are many things that I think too simply, but there's no turning back now. She retracted her hand and lowered her head. Also, don't tell him that I love him. Yi Liangqiu slowly stood up. I have my reasons for doing this. Chapter 1741. He thought that it must have something to do with Lady Qin. It was related to old Lady Qin's death, so it was probably not a good thing. That was why Liangqiu didn't say anything. He thought that if President Qin knew the truth, he probably wouldn't be able to accept it. That was why Yi Liangqiu was struggling. Was it time to put an end to it? Who would end who? President Qin was safe and sound in this game of chess. What about Liangqiu? Yi Liangqiu walked out of the cafe. Xing followed her and opened the car door for her. After sitting down, she gently touched her forehead with her fingers. Has Su Shircheng been with a woman this week? Xing thought for a while and said with certainty, not yet. It's been about a week since the last time. Yi Liangqiu's fingers tapped on the steering wheel. She was deep in thought. I heard that Xia Mian is short of money? Xing didn't say anything.
He didn't know about this.
Yi Liangqiu continued. Xia Mian wants to buy a villa downtown. It's worth 50 to 60 million. She's just popular. How can she afford it? She had contacted Ying Jie. Ying Jie sighed and said that Xia Mian didn't have a long way to go. She hadn't done anything yet. She had gotten quite a lot from following President Ying for one night. These days, she didn't reject anyone who could afford it. Ying Jie sneered. Does she really think that she can sleep with a diva? Those who are really capable won't fall for the unspoken rules easily. Those people saw it too. Actresses with good acting skills were always valued. They wouldn't easily get involved with them. But Xia Mian didn't understand. She lost hope in President Qin, so she just wanted to make money. That villa was about 20 million yuan short of that amount. King Entertainment warned Xia Mian that it was impossible to get it. It was dark and they couldn't find a way. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Xing, make the arrangements. Send Xia Mian to Su Shircheng's bed for 20 million. Xing nodded. All right, I'll inform the brothers over there. I think Mr. Su will be very satisfied with Xia Mian. Yi Liangqiu sneered. Xing didn't understand why she was doing this. Wasn't it better for Xia Mian to stay out of it? Why must she contact Su Shircheng? Yi Liangqiu did not speak. She only looked at Xing and said gently, You will follow me from now on, understand? She used to be alone, but then she had Lin Xingyuan, and now she was alone again. This time, Xing was beside her. She wanted to protect him and not let him lose his life, like Xingyuan. Sometimes Su Shircheng was right. She and he were actually the same. Cold blood flowed in their bones. One day later, Xia Mian saw the 20 million yuan in cash. The one who made the deal with her was a middle-aged man wearing sunglasses. He looked like a bodyguard. Who is your boss? Xia Mian was still a little hesitant. The money she earned so quickly was directly proportional to her hard work. What if the other party was a pervert? The man looked at Xia Mian and said calmly, If there is a special need, Miss Xia will also need to agree. Of course, our boss will not mistreat Miss Xia. Xia Mian was very tempted. She wanted to buy the villa in full. All the people living there were famous people. She wanted to be a part of the rich district even in her dreams. She stared at the money and hesitated for a while. Finally, she gritted her teeth and agreed. All right, Chapter 1742. She knew Su Shircheng. She had met him a few times. She could still look at him in the past, but now he looked like a withered old man, like those perverts on TV. He was also dressed in a strange Chinese tunic suit and held a dragon-headed cane in his hand. Just looking at him made her nauseous. How could she sleep? I don't want the money. Xia Mian, who was wearing a light purple dress, immediately turned around to leave. She walked quickly, afraid that the person behind her wouldn't let her go. She had a premonition that Su Shircheng wouldn't let her go. He was Yi Liangqiu's father, and neither of them was good. No matter how fast she walked, her long hair was still pulled from behind. Su Shircheng did it himself. Pulling Xia Mian's hair, he dragged her back into the living room, threw her on the sofa, and looked down at her. His dark yellow face was like a slab of stone, as if stiff flesh was stuck flat to his skull. It was hair-raising. "Miss Xia, you've just arrived, and you want to leave already?" His eyes were deep, and there was a small flame hidden in them, which reminded people of spiritual fire. Xia Mian sat up and curled up on the sofa. She hugged her knees with her hands and tried her best to shrink in. Her voice trembled as she said, "Mr. Su, I didn't take a penny with me. If you don't believe me, you can count." Su Shircheng turned around and still looked at her quietly. "You don't have to count because it will all be yours in a while." Xia Mian swallowed hard. She looked at Su Shircheng's body and trembled in fear. In her eyes, Su Shircheng looked like a half-dead man who had stepped into a coffin. It was frightening. What if he died while lying on top of her? Wouldn't it be frightening? Xia Mian's lips trembled. After a long time, she said carefully, "I don't want to sell it." Su Shircheng smiled. He raised the golden dragon-headed cane in his hand and gently slid it across Xia Mian's delicate little face. His smile was so eerie that he looked like a living dead person. "Miss Xia, it's always the customers who pick the chickens." "How can a chicken pick the customers?" As he spoke, he gently unbuttoned 2 buttons, letting her see his sagging skin. "Do you think I'm old?" She paused for a moment, and her voice became even more gentle with a hint of coaxing. "But money is not old. You see, Grandpa Mao is the same up there. Everyone's money is the same, and it's all dirty. It's just that if you put it in your pocket, it won't be dirty. Isn't that right, Miss Xia?" Xia Mian cried. Su Shircheng suddenly hit her arm with his walking stick. He hit her quite hard. She screamed and cried out, partly because of pain, partly because of fear. "Miss Xia, I've wanted to get intimate with you for a long time." Su Shircheng picked up the stack of money on the coffee table, pulled out a stack, and threw it at Xia Mian's body. "I have a lot of money, and you have a young body." As he spoke, he laughed so hard that his hair stood on end. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Let's go upstairs and play with something different." Xia Mian's body trembled. Something different? He was indeed a pervert. But she had no choice. She would be tortured without money, so she might as well take the money. Xia Mian boldly reached out her hand. "I want 50 million. Su Shircheng smiled coldly. "Let's see if you're worth the price." Chapter 1743. She even thought that it would be a good choice to become Yi Liangqiu's stepmother. By then, she would be above Yi Liangqiu. But she didn't think that Su Shircheng wouldn't think that way. In his heart, except for Hong Ko, who was a goddess, all other women, including Liangqiu's mother, were nothing. After using them, he could discard them. But when Su Shircheng was torturing Xia Mian, he forgot about his weak body. This time, his bones were almost broken, and he had a high fever. At dawn, Su Shircheng's body was weak. He fell to the side, and even foamed at the mouth. Xia Mian was scared to death. She curled up like a shrimp and retreated desperately until she reached the head of the bed. Her fingers tightly grasped the edge of the bed, looking at Su Shircheng's half-dead appearance. She was extremely scared. If Su Shircheng died, would she go to jail? Su Shircheng's eyes rolled up. Like a dead fish, he struggled a few times and then stopped moving. Xia Mian let out a hoarse cry. She covered her mouth and looked terrified. She instinctively looked at the door of the bedroom. The door was closed, so no one should have noticed Su Shirching's abnormality. Xia Mian pursed her trembling lips. After a long time, she finally plucked up the courage and reached out her hand to touch him. Su Shirching was still warm. She wasn't sure, but she was also worried. Could Su Shirching still be alive? She clenched her teeth and held back the scream. Then, she touched his nose.
He was still alive.
She let out a sigh of relief and moved down the bed, her eyes still fixed on Su Shirching. However, her hand accidentally slipped, and a cell phone on the bedside slipped to the ground. It was Su Shirching's phone. Xia Mian hesitated. She wanted to run away, but she didn't want to give up. She might not get the 20 million. Besides, could there be any secrets in Su Shirching's phone? Xia Mian's fingers trembled as she picked it up. She wanted to unlock it, but the phone had a fingerprint lock. She glanced at the withered old thing lying on the ground and carefully crawled over. She grabbed one of Su Shirching's hands and used it to unlock the phone. He turned on his phone. There was nothing inside, but there was a notification that he had sent a voice message to Yiliangqiu. Xia Mian opened it and was stunned by what she heard. That woman's voice is Yiliangqiu's? Xia Mian listened to the voice again and repeated it 4 or 5 times before she was sure that it was Yiliangqiu. She laughed sinisterly, and her laughter was especially cold. It turned out that Yiliangqiu was not much cleaner than her. It turned out that she had been raped. Why was that voice so pleasing to the ear? It was really nice to hear. Xia Mian forgot her fear and giggled. In the middle of the night, she felt her hair stand on end. She put on her pajamas and leaned against the headboard leisurely. She looked at the message and then forwarded it. The recipient was Qin Anlin. Seeing that the message had been successfully sent on the screen, Xia Mian was full of joy. She thought of countless intimate moments between Qin Anlin and Yiliangqiu, and she was like a clown from beginning to end. But now it was different. Yiliangqiu was no longer clean. Would Qin Anlin still want her? He would probably hate her to death. After sending the message, Xia Mian erased the message. Chapter 1744. On the other side, in the Su mansion, Yiliangqiu wasn't asleep. She was sitting on the sofa in front of the French window, leaving her back view to Ah Xing. Ah Xing stood there obediently. Suddenly, his phone rang. He picked it up and glanced at it. Then he looked up and said, "President Yi, Su Shirching sent a message. It's from Xia Mian." Yiliangqiu sat quietly and didn't turn around. After a while, she asked, "Where's Su Shirching?" After he drank the medicine, the after-effects were strong. "Now, it's not good." Ah Xing hesitated and asked, "Should we make a move now?" Make a move? Yiliangqiu wanted to make a move too, but she couldn't. No one knew where Qin Pei was. Only Su Shirching knew. Get someone to guard the door. Don't let Xia Mian leave for now. Also, Yiliangqiu stood up. Ah Xing, don't let Su Shirching know what Xia Mian did for now. Ah Xing nodded. Okay. I'll make the arrangements. I'll get the doctor to come and give him special instructions. Yiliangqiu nodded. You did well. Ah Xing looked confused. He didn't know what she meant by well and what she meant by not well. He only knew that Mr. Su was too cruel. How could he do such a thing to Miss Hua? In the past, he felt that Miss Hua was unreachable. But now, he felt that Miss Hua was very pitiful. Miss Hua lived in a trap. She tried her best to protect the person she wanted to protect. Ah Xing knew that Miss Hua only had President Qin in her heart. Since Miss Hua wanted to protect President Qin, he would protect Miss Hua. In this world, there was no absolute right or wrong. As long as it was beneficial to Miss Hua, Ah Xing felt that it was right. Ah Xing walked out. The door opened and closed. Yiliangqiu turned around slowly. Everything was going smoothly. Xia Mian found out the secret and sent it to Qin Anlin. What she wanted was for Qin Anlin to hate her and give up on her. What she wanted was to fight with her life on the line, to completely crush Su Shirching's last hope. She couldn't put it off any longer. She was going crazy. However, she knew that if she did this, Anlin would hate her to death. He would be disappointed. The phone in her hand rang urgently one after another, as if it was urging her to die, and even more so, urging her to die. She knew that it was from Qin Anlin. It was already dawn. The weak light shone into his eyes, and it was actually dazzling. Tears welled up in his eyes as well as a slight pain, but her heart slowly turned cold and hard. She had to be cold. On Su Shirching's side, Xia Mian had gotten what she wanted. She wanted to escape, but when she opened the door, she saw two men in black standing guard outside. She hesitated for a moment, then slammed the door shut and glared at the dead man on the bed. When Su Shirching wore his clothes, he could no longer be seen. Now that he was not wearing anything, it was even more frightening. She stared at him for a long time before she finally opened the door and smiled sweetly. Mr. Su seems to have overexerted himself. Can we call a doctor? The man at the door poked his head in and immediately came in, followed by his companion. After seeing Su Shirching, they immediately contacted the doctor. Xia Mian wanted to run away, but she was held down by the guards until the doctor came. After the examination, Su Shirching woke up, but he still had a high fever. Linda looked at Ah Xing and suddenly felt that Ah Xing was different. She coughed softly. Ah Xing, why do I feel that you are like... Suddenly, she coughed softly. Do you like Mr. Yi? She did not expect to get any response, but Ah Xing did, and he was very straightforward. Yes, I like Mr. Yi. It's not a crime to like someone. It's a crime to hurt someone, Ah Xing added in his heart. Linda was stunned. Firstly, she did not expect Ah Xing to admit it. Secondly, when did Ah Xing become so domineering? Chapter 1746. On the other hand, Qin Anlin had dragged Yi Liangqiu to a place where there was no one around. She was thrown against the car door with a loud thud, and her back was hurting. Then he leaned over and pinched her chin with his cold fingers. Tell me what happened. Yi Liangqiu looked straight at him. Did Su Shirching send it to you? His eyes narrowed. Yi Liangqiu. His tone was gloomy, as though a storm was brewing. She leaned her head against the front of the car and chuckled. What do you want me to say? That I was forced to do it? She looked at him and said mildly, Anlin, it was indeed forced at first, but later on, he panted heavily and stared at her. Yi Liangqiu, you'd better think carefully before you say every word. He suddenly reached out and hit the car window behind her. Because it was made of reinforced glass, there was a loud thud, and then a gush of warm blood sprayed on the side of her face. She closed her eyes tightly and looked vulnerable. Qin Anlin, I give up. His entire body was tense, and he stared at her as though he wanted to carve his gaze into the depths of her soul. For a very, very long time, they didn't make a sound. He looked at her fluttering long eyelashes and her slightly frightened face. He only felt that she was a stranger. Yi Liangqiu, don't you have anything to say to me? His fingers caressed the side of her face, and his voice was trembling slightly. As long as you say it, I'll believe you. Believe that you're innocent and that you were forced to do it. She opened her eyes and looked into his eyes. In his eyes, there was a pain that she could understand. Yi Liangqiu smiled bitterly and shook her head. No, Anlin, it's not what you think. She sighed. I know you've already prepared the separation agreement. Since there's no possibility between us, she suddenly changed the topic. It's just like back then. You should understand how I felt. As soon as she finished speaking, he stared at her as if she was a stranger. How could he not understand? Yes, he understood. But what he didn't understand was why she did it. In his heart, there had always been a happy ending. He had repeatedly given in to her, had repeatedly indulged her. But this matter, he could not tolerate. He had questioned her in the name of her husband, and in return, he had received such an understatement. He smiled bleakly took a step back, and looked at her carefully from top to bottom, as if it was the first time, and also as if it was the last time. Liangqiu, do you know? Even so, I still think that I can forgive you. He raised his head slightly. It didn't seem like he was talking to her, but more like he was talking to himself. I'm becoming less and less like myself. Her heart trembled. How could she not know his decision? No matter how much he changed for her, if she challenged his bottom line, he would become the original Qin Anlin. This was what she wanted. Perhaps she had been too greedy from the start. Sometimes, she would wonder if it wasn't worth it. But she knew that he might be in pain if he lost her, but this pain would fade with time. But if he knew the truth, Anlin would never be happy. He slowly lowered his eyes and gazed at her intently. He said softly, Liangqiu, I'll send you the divorce agreement. Her heart wrenched fiercely. Chapter 1747. He retreated step by step. Finally, he turned around. Anlin, you must be happy, she said softly. His body stopped, and he suddenly turned around, staring at her with a deep gaze. After a long while, he said calmly, Is that so? Without her, he would not be happy. However, he did not know how to love her and how to persevere in this love. Whenever he closed his eyes for that recording, his mind would be filled with the man's panting and her screams. Later on, it was not like that anymore. She seemed to be willing. He could distinguish the sounds of a man and a woman when they were having fun. If it was not pain, then it was enjoyment. Liangqiu, you said that if I dared to have another man, you would not want me anymore. Now that you have another man, can I not want you anymore? He paused and looked at her.
So did she.
At this moment, Xing walked quickly towards Yi Liangqiu and asked with concern, Mr. Yi, are you all right? Yi Liangqiu shook her head. I'm fine. Qin Anlin was about to leave, but his body suddenly shook. It was Xing's voice. It was only then that he noticed that Xing's voice was the same as the voice in the recording. Xing was the man who had her. Qin Anlin's expression became extremely ugly. He stared at Xing, turned his head and asked Yi Liangqiu softly, Is he your loyal dog? Or is he specially used to satisfy your man? Yi Liangqiu took a step back while Xing went over and stood in front of Yi Liangqiu. President Qin, you are not allowed to insult our Mr. Yi. Insult? Qin Anlin's voice was cold. Aren't you the person in the recording? Xing paused for a moment and did not know what to say. He instinctively looked at Yi Liangqiu. Yes. It's Xing. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly, but her eyes were empty. Anlin, Xing is only by my side when I need him. It's like summer sleep. Qin Anlin looked at her, and his pupils suddenly contracted. He laughed.
Xiamian?
He shook his head. There was never anything between us. Of course, Yi Liangqiu knew that, but that was all she could say. She wanted him to be well. Qin Anlin's gaze landed on Xing's face. He looked at him for a long time before he threw a punch at him. Xing's body was forced to retreat a few steps, and he could barely stand. He didn't retaliate. He just stood firm and said in a deep voice, I like young miss. After he finished speaking, Xing raised his eyes and looked straight at Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin wanted to attack again, but he restrained himself. This was because the woman went over and held her loyal dog. She wiped the blood off the corner of the dog's mouth with a worried look on her face. There was nothing for him to do. It wasn't worth it for her. He smiled faintly and kept retreating. That's it. Liangqiu, that's it. She looked at him as he kept retreating. She knew how painful his heart was, and hers was even more painful. When she was numb from the pain, it would no longer hurt. She turned sideways and looked at Xing. Are you all right? That punch was not light. She broke up with Qin Anlin, but she implicated Xing. She felt a little guilty. The corner of Xing's mouth was swollen, but he was still grinning. I'm fine. He wanted to coax her and make her happy, but he was clumsy and didn't dare to make a sound. Yi Liangqiu covered her forehead for a while before she slowly threw the tissue away. I have to stand on Su Shirqing's side now. Only when she and Qin Anlin were completely done for would Su Shirqing be driven to desperate action. And she was waiting for the final blow. She looked at Ah Xing gently. If it comes to the last moment, Ah Xing, you have to protect yourself. When Ah Xing heard this, he could not take it anymore. Of course, I have to protect you. Chapter 1749. He was an honest man. He thought for a while and added, Ah Xing doesn't care what others say. I just want to stay by Elder Missy's side. I don't want anything else. He was already a man without roots. He liked Elder Missy, and he was satisfied to be able to stay by her side. Yi Liangqiu looked at Ah Xing and smiled faintly. Ah Xing, you should have your own life. Ah Xing disagreed. Elder Missy's life will be Ah Xing's life in the future. Yi Liangqiu was a little touched. Ah Xing reminded her of herself in the past. Back then, she was also like this, treating Qin Anlin's life as her own. She felt a lump in her throat. She smiled faintly and said, Okay. Ah Xing's honest face was filled with a satisfied smile. He drove her to the hospital. After a checkup, the doctor said that it was just a superficial injury. She would be fine after applying an okay bandage. When they went out, Yi Liangqiu saw Ah Xing's tensed face. She couldn't help but comfort him. Look, it's just a superficial injury. Ah Xing disagreed as he drove. A small injury is still an injury. What if it smashed your head? Yi Liangqiu smiled. It's actually not bad. At least you don't have to worry anymore. This was the first time Ah Xing stared at her. It was a fierce stare. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. She smiled and sat down. The car drove through the night in B City. The whole city was filled with neon lights. There was nowhere to escape. She leaned her head against the back of the seat and looked out of the window quietly. Ah Xing only regained his senses after a long time. He turned his head and looked at her. Elder Missy? Yi Liangqiu sniffled. Ah Xing, don't bother about me. I want to be alone for a while. Ah Xing paused for a moment. Then, he realized that he would never be able to enter Elder Missy's heart in this lifetime. Even though Elder Missy didn't treat him as an outsider, the person she liked was still a man like President Qin. Ah Xing drove quietly. He opened the car door for her when they reached the Sue's house. When the car door was opened, she was still sitting there. There was an unconcealable embarrassment in her eyes. She was crying. Ah Xing was at a loss. He didn't know how to comfort Missy, and he didn't know if he should leave now. After a long while, he stretched out his trembling hand and carelessly wiped Yi Liangqiu's eyelids. His voice was also messy. Eldest miss, don't cry. Ah Xing doesn't know how to coax people. His hands were rough, and she had been crying, so her eyelids were a little thin. Wiping them like this actually hurt a little. However, Yi Liangqiu smiled instead. She looked up, and there were still tears in her eyes. Ah Xing, you're already doing a good job of coaxing him now. When she said that, Ah Xing blushed and was speechless for a long time. He rubbed his clothes and said, Elder Miss is making fun of Ah Xing again. No, it's true. Yi Liangqiu patted him, got off the car, and smiled at him. Ah Xing looked at her in a daze. After a while, he also laughed foolishly. After they left, Su Shirqing did not stay idle. He took out his phone and looked at it. The message had been deleted. However, he still asked someone to check it. It turned out that there was indeed a message sent from his phone. It was a voice message. Su Shirqing didn't doubt that it was Xia Mian who did it. It was because Xia Mian always had feelings for Qin Anlin. After discovering Yi Liangqiu's sore spot, it was reasonable for her to send it to Qin Anlin. Su Shirqing would never have thought that all of this was a trap set up by Yi Liangqiu. Chapter 1750. At that moment, Su Shirqing almost went crazy. He yelled almost crazily, "Dig that woman out for me?" His ruthlessness made it seem like he was going to whip a corpse. His subordinates immediately got the order. In less than 2 hours, they found Xia Mian and threw her on the floor of the living room downstairs. Xia Mian was lying on the ground. She had been hit in the head and passed out. At that moment, a large basin of ice water was poured on her head. She woke up even if she didn't want to. She shook her head and struggled to raise her head. Then, she saw Su Shirching sitting on the sofa with a gloomy face. Xia Mian's body instinctively shrank. She wanted to get up, but her foot slipped and she immediately fell heavily on the ground. She felt like all the bones in her body were about to be torn apart. A foot was stepping on her palm. He believed that if she dared to move again, her hand would be crippled. Xia Mian didn't dare to act rashly. She lay on the ground and looked at Su Shirching awkwardly. She begged, "Mr. Su, why are you doing this to me?" She seemed to have thought of something and said hurriedly, "I can accompany Mr. Su again. No matter how many times." Su Shircheng was still sitting on the sofa, without saying a word. His subordinate stepped on Xia Mian and said coldly, "Even Mr. Su will lose his appetite if he touches a woman like you again." Su Shircheng raised his hand. Xia Mian's body is still in good shape. This has nothing to do with her IQ. Xia Mian's heart skipped a beat. She guessed that it had something to do with the information she had received. She immediately lay on the ground and said, "Mr. Su, I didn't do it on purpose. I just can't accept it." "You can't accept it?" Su Shirching sneered. "You like Qin Anlin, don't you? You despise an old man like me, don't you?" Xia Mian swallowed hard and shook her head desperately. "No, I don't. I admire Mr. Su. Really, even 10 President Qin can't compare to Mr. Su." "Admire?" Su Shirching stood up and slowly walked in front of Xia Mian. He looked down at her coldly with his gloomy eyes. "Then let me see how you admire me." He squatted down and pinched Xia Mian's sharp chin. "You know, if I find out that you're lying, you'll be punished." His voice was extremely gentle, but it was the cruelest words in the world. Xia Mian was trembling in fear, but she didn't dare to disobey Su Shirching. Otherwise, he would really kill her. She bit her lips desperately and endured the nausea to serve him. But halfway through, Su Shirching kicked her away. He looked up at his underlings and said, "Didn't you say that you wanted to have a taste of being a celebrity?" After a pause, Su Shirching said word by word under Xia Mian's horrified gaze, "This woman is yours." He turned around and left. Behind him, Xia Mian's shrill scream rang out, "No!" But Su Shirching didn't stop. He heard the unbearable sounds behind him. He was indifferent. Such a woman had to be treated like this. She dared to betray him right under his nose. He would punish her 100-fold. He sat on the sofa and coldly watched Xia Mian struggle and suffer. It was as if he was watching a performance. In the end, he raised his hand and said, "It's about time. Save it for tomorrow." Tomorrow you're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.